The heat in Dust Devil Flats was a physical weight, a smothering blanket woven from grit and shimmering air. It pressed down on the false fronts of the clapboard buildings and baked the silence into the street. Inside the First Territorial Bank, the air tasted of stale paper metal coin and the sweat of nervous men. Rhett Callahan, all 58 years of his life etched into the sun-cured leather of his face, felt the wrongness of the place the moment he stepped inside. It wasn't the heat. It was the quiet, a held-breath stillness that vibrated with unspoken tension. 4 men stood in the lobby. They weren't customers. Their dusters were too heavy for the season worn to hide the shotguns and Colts beneath. The bank teller, a young man with a premature bald spot, was sweating more than the heat warranted his eyes wide with a terror he was trying to swallow. Rhett's hand, resting near the worn grip of his Colt Peacemaker, didn't move. He had come to Dust Devil Flats to collect a bounty on a card, sharp, a simple job. This was not simple. His gaze drifted past the men to a teenage girl standing by the manager's office, clutching a leather satchel. She couldn't have been more than 16, with dark hair pulled back from a face that was still soft with youth. She looked like Sarah. The thought was a physical blow, a ghost's hand squeezing the air from his lungs. For 9 years he had seen his daughter in the faces of strangers, but never like this. It was the same determined set of her jaw, the same wide, intelligent eyes. Then he saw it gleaming against the simple cotton of her dress, a silver locket on a delicate chain. It was oval, with a small, intricately carved sparrow in mid-flight on its surface. Identical. The world seemed to tilt. He was back on the banks of Redemption Creek, the cool morning air thick with the scent of wet earth and dread. He saw that locket mud-caked and cold in the palm of the man who had pulled Sarah's body from the reeds. A gift from her mother, her most prized possession. The leader of the robbers, a burly man with a scar that split his left eyebrow, finally noticed Rhett. "Lost old man," he growled, his hand moving under his duster. Rhett's focus snapped back to the present, but the ghost of the memory lingered, chilling him, despite the oppressive heat. Just making a withdrawal, Rhett set his voice a low, gravelly rumble. The illusion of peace shattered. The man with the scar drew his Colt. "This is a robbery, nobody move." The other 3 followed suit, their movements practiced. 2 covered the teller, while the 3rd blocked the door. The leader strode toward the girl. "You. Come here." She froze her eyes, darting toward Rhett, a silent plea for help. The man grabbed her, yanking her in front of him, as a shield his arm, a thick bar across her throat. His free hand holding the pistol pressed against her temple. In the struggle, his fingers brushed against the locket. He glanced down, a flicker of surprise on his face, before he tightened his grip on the girl. "Don't even think about it, Grandpa. One twitch and she's gone." Rhett's world narrowed to the man, the girl, and the locket. The past and present had collapsed into a single, unbearable moment. Sarah's face pale and still. This girl's face alive and terrified. The locket a silver link between the dead and the potentially dead. His hand, which had dispatched dozens of men with cold efficiency, felt heavy and clumsy. The 9 years of carefully constructed solitude, of burying his grief under a mountain of dust and blood and bounty money, crumbled to dust. "Let her go," Rhett said, his voice unnervingly calm. The robber laughed, a harsh grating sound. "You're in no position to make demands." He started backing toward the door, dragging the girl with him. "Tell her the money now." Rhett saw his opening. The robber's attention was divided. His focus on the girl was absolute, but his tactical awareness was compromised. Rhett's gun was in his hand before the thought was complete. The air cracked. The shot was not aimed at the leader, but at the man guarding the door. The gunman crumpled a look of astonishment on his face. The other two spun toward Rhett, but they were too slow. 2 more shots, precise and economical. One fell. The other staggered back, clutching a wounded shoulder. The leader panicked. He shoved the girl forward, using her momentum to create space as he fired wildly at Rhett. Dust and splinters erupted from the wooden counter next to Rhett's head. He didn't flinch. He moved, stepping into the open, making himself the only target. The girl stumbled and fell clear. For a fraction of a second, the robber was exposed. Rhett fired. The gun bucked, dust kicked, the man fell. Silence descended once more, thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. The teller was hiding behind the counter. The girl was on the floor, breathing in ragged sobs. Rhett holstered his Colt and walked to her, his old leg wound protesting with a dull ache. He knelt, his knees cracking. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, her eyes still wide with shock. Her hand went instinctively to her throat, to the silver locket. He almost... "It's over now," Rhett said, his voice softer than he intended. He helped her to her feet. The town sheriff burst in, followed by a crowd of curious townsfolk, their faces a mixture of fear and excitement. The aftermath was a familiar routine for Rhett. Questions, statements, the undertaker's grim work. He answered mechanically, his mind elsewhere, trapped in the echo of the confrontation. Later, as he was collecting the unexpected bounty on the dead robbers, the telegraph operator handed him a folded piece of paper. "This came for you this morning, Mr. Callahan." Rhett's fingers, steady moments before, as he pulled a trigger, trembled slightly as he unfolded it. The message was short, the words stark against the yellow paper. "They're doing it again. Another girl. Same cross, L." The telegram was from Levi Harmon, his former deputy in Redemption Creek. The words sliced through the fog of his rekindled grief and gave it a terrible, sharp focus. The cross. The small, hand-carved wooden cross Sarah had worn, found tangled with the locket around her neck. He reached into the breast pocket of his worn coat and pulled out a small, leather-bound daguerreotype, its edges worn smooth from a decade of handling. A younger Rhett stood with his wife Margaret, her smile gentle even in the faded image. Between them stood Sarah, at 16, her eyes bright with a future she would never have. Margaret had been gone 12 years, taken by fever. Sarah, 9 years, taken by something far crueler. Drowned, they called it. An accident. A lie he had been forced to live with. He had been the sheriff of Redemption Creek, then a man respected, even feared. His daughter's death had shattered his world. He had seen the bruises on her neck shaped like fingertips. He knew Sarah was a strong swimmer, who feared the deep currents of the creek after dark. When he started asking questions, pointing out inconsistencies, the town's sympathy curdled into suspicion. Mayor Thaddeus Maxwell, a man whose ambition was as vast as the desert sky, had been the most vocal proponent of letting the tragedy rest. For the good of the town, he'd set his voice smooth as polished silver. "We must move on." Rhett had refused. He pushed until his office was ransacked, his evidence vanished, and a dismissal warrant signed by Maxwell's town council appeared on his desk. He was run out of his own life, an exile haunted by whispers and unanswered questions. He had become a bounty hunter, a man who dealt with a simpler, more obvious form of evil. For 9 years he had tried to outrun the ghost of his daughter. Now the telegram and the locket had conspired to end the chase. He tucked the daguerreotype away, the faces of his lost family, a burning imprint behind his eyes. The bank robbery hadn't been a random act of violence. It was a sign, a summons. The past was not dead. It wasn't even past. He walked out of the telegraph office into the blinding sheet of sun-bleached salt flats that passed for a main street. The air shimmered over the cracked earth, thick enough to taste. He looked east toward the distant mountains that hid the town he had sworn never to see again. Unfinished business. Unfinished business in Redemption Creek. He said to the empty street the words, tasting of dust and resolve. 3 days of hard riding carried Rhett across a landscape that grew more hostile with every mile. The sun was a merciless hammer, the wind a sculptor of canyons and a thief of moisture. His horse, a tough palomino named Buck, moved with the steady ground-eating gait of an animal that knew its work. Rhett rode through the memories, letting them come. The laughter of his daughter as she learned to ride. The scent of wood smoke from their hearth. The cold, final weight of her hand in his. He remembered the wooden cross, a simple thing she'd carved with her mother one winter afternoon. He remembered the men who had stonewalled his investigation, Thaddeus Maxwell, and his arrogant son, Edgar, their condolences as hollow as a dried gourd. As Redemption Creek finally materialized on the horizon, a smudge of civilization in the vast emptiness, Rhett felt the familiar weight of loss settle in his chest. But now it was mixed with something else, a cold, clarifying anger. The town had metastasized. What he remembered as a struggling mining settlement had swelled into a place of false fronts and long shadows, where the glint of new money couldn't quite cover the rot underneath. The Maxwell silver mine, once on the verge of collapse, now dominated the landscape. Its new machinery a testament to a sudden, immense prosperity. He rode down the main street, the hooves of his horse muffled by the thick dust. Maxwell's mercantile had doubled in size. The Blue Diamond Saloon, once a rough-and-tumble watering hole, now boasted a freshly painted facade and ornate glass windows. And at the far end of the street, commanding the town like a fortress, stood Maxwell Manor, a 2-story mansion whose white columns were an obscene monument to wealth in a land defined by scarcity. Rhett dismounted outside the Blue Diamond, its smoke-stained tin ceiling and a piano, missing half its keys, a small comfort of familiarity. He ordered a whiskey and listened. The talk was of silver prices, land speculation, and a public punishment. Hanging the girl tomorrow at noon, a grimy miner said to his companion. Mighty harsh for theft, the other replied. Well, she cut the Maxwell boy too. With sewing scissors of all things. Mayor says we need to make an example. Rhett's hand paused the whiskey glass halfway to his lips. He set it down. At the far end of the bar, a man sat hunched over his drink, a ghost from Rhett's past. Levi Harmon. The years had not been kind. His deputy's uniform had been replaced by ragged clothes, his face bloated and sagging with the weight of whiskey and regret. Their eyes met across the smoky room. Levi gave a barely perceptible nod toward the back alley. Outside, amidst the stench of stale beer and refuse, Levi spoke, his voice a slurred whisper. You got my telegram then. Tell me what's happening, Levi? It's happening again, Rhett. Just like with Sarah. Levi's hands shook as he fumbled with a flask. They're hanging a girl. Clara Dawson. She worked at the seamstress shop. They say she stole from Edgar Maxwell, but that's horseshit. What's the truth? Levi let out a bitter, rattling laugh. Truth died in this town a long time ago. Edgar, he tried to force himself on her. She fought back. Cut him. Now she's a thief and an attempted murderer. And the wooden cross, Rhett's voice was grim. Levi's bloodshot eyes widened. How did you... Lucky guess. Rhett's patience was gone. Where is she? Town square, tied to the post, making an example. Levi's voice cracked, a fissure of self-loathing breaking through the alcoholic haze. I couldn't save Sarah, Rhett. I was too afraid. But maybe Maybe you can save this one. Rhett left him there, striding toward the town square, each step a hammer blow against the dust of 9 years. A crowd had gathered their faces, a mixture of morbid curiosity and civic duty. In the center, bound to a thick wooden post, was a young woman. Her dress was torn, her dark hair matted with dirt and sweat, but her head was held high. And around her neck, stark against her bruised skin, hung a small wooden cross nearly identical to the one he could see so clearly in his memory. Sheriff Bennett, the man who had taken Rhett's badge, stood nearby, looking profoundly uncomfortable. Beside him, dressed in an expensive suit that defied the heat, was Edgar Maxwell. He was handsome in a way that curdled on the stomach, his face radiating an easy, predatory arrogance. As Clara Dawson lifted her head, her eyes found Rhett's. They were not filled with fear, but with a fire that refused to be quenched. "Well, well," Edgar drawled, a smirk playing on his lips. "The prodigal lawman returns. Come to witness Justice Callahan." "Is that what you call this?" Rhett's voice was as cold and flat as a tombstone. His eyes shifted to the sheriff. "This what passes for law in your town now, Bennett?" Bennett shifted his weight. "She stole property, assaulted Mr. Maxwell. The punishment is in accordance with territorial law." "Is it now?" Rhett stepped forward, and the crowd parted before him as if he were a leper. Strange how the law seems to bend to accommodate certain names. Edgar's smile was a razor slash. "We've managed just fine without your particular brand of justice. The town prospers. The mine yields silver. Law and order prevail." "Order, maybe," Rhett said, his gaze fixed on the girl. "But law, I wonder." He stopped directly in front of her, close enough to see the defiant spark in her blue eyes. "They say you're a thief," he said quietly for her alone. "They say a lot of things in this town." She replied, her voice raw but steady. "Most of them are lies." Suddenly her voice rose clear and sharp, cutting through the tension. "They do this to all of us. The ones who say no. Sarah was just the first." The name spoken aloud in this place struck Rhett like a physical blow. A cold, terrible certainty settled deep in his bones. Without a moment's hesitation, he acted. His Colt was in his hand, not as a threat, but as a tool. He fired. The shot wasn't aimed at a man, but at the ropes binding Clara to the post. The sharp crack of the pistol echoed across the square, and the top rope snapped. He fired again. The second rope parted. Chaos erupted. Bennett and his deputies fumbled for their weapons. Rhett fired twice more, his aim precise, disabling, not killing. One deputy grabbed his shoulder, another his leg. As the crowd scattered screaming, Rhett seized Clara's arm. "Can you ride?" She nodded, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning hope. "Then run." They raced for buck bullets, whizzing past them, kicking up puffs of dust at their feet. Rhett threw her onto the saddle and swung up behind her, his body shielding hers. With a sharp kick, he spurred the horse into a gallop, thundering out of town, under a hail of ineffective gunfire, leaving the corrupted heart of Redemption Creek behind them in a cloud of dust and fury. Night fell like a shroud over the desert, erasing the horizon and bringing a deceptive coolness to the air. They rode hard for hours, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Maxwell's town before seeking refuge. Rhett's old cabin, nestled in a small hidden canyon, was just as he had left it. Weathered but sound, a stoic testament to survival, much like the man himself. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dried juniper and disuse. He lit a kerosene lamp, its warm glow pushing back the oppressive darkness. Clara sank onto a rough-hewn wooden chair, the adrenaline that had sustained her finally draining away, leaving a bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. The cabin was Spartan, a stone fireplace, a table, a curtained-off sleeping alcove. and a formidable collection of rifles and shotguns mounted on the walls. "There's a wash basin behind the screen," Rhett said, his tone all business. "Spare shirt and trousers there. Too big, but they're clean." While she washed away the grime and humiliation of the town square, Rhett prepared a simple meal of beans and salt pork. She emerged looking small and lost inside his oversized clothes, but the fire was back in her eyes. They ate in a charged silence, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against tin plates and the lonely cry of a coyote in the distance. Finally, with cups of strong black coffee between them, Rhett spoke. "Tell me everything?" Clara studied his face, her gaze searching and direct. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her. "I came to Redemption Creek 2 years ago. Mrs. Reed, the seamstress, she took me in, taught me the trade." Her voice was flat, devoid of self-pity. "Edgar Maxwell took an interest about 6 months ago. First, it was compliments and then gifts I never asked for." She paused, taking a steadying sip of coffee. 3 days ago, he came to the shop when Mrs. Reed was out. He said he wouldn't be refused again. That's when you cut him." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "He tore my dress. I grabbed my sewing scissors and cut his arm. Not deep, but he screamed like a stuck pig. And then Bennett arrested you. That night. For theft of Edgar's gold watch, which I never touched, and attempted murder." She touched her bruised cheek. Some of his deputies were very enthusiastic about getting a confession. "Mrs. Reed," Rhett prompted. "The one who gave you the cross." Clara's eyes clouded with a fresh wave of pain. "They found her dead the next morning. In the shop. Said her heart gave out." She looked at Rhett, her disbelief plain. Her heart was as strong as an ox's. "You mentioned my daughter Rhett," said his voice carefully neutral. "You said her name. Sarah." "Only whispers," Clara admitted. "Mrs. Reed mentioned her once. Said she was a brave girl who saw something she shouldn't have." Clara's fingers went to the wooden cross at her neck. "She gave this to me the day before she died. Said it belonged to a girl who stood up to the Maxwells. Said I might need its protection." A muscle feathered in Rhett's jaw. "That cross belonged to my daughter." Clara's eyes widened. You're Sarah's father." Before he could answer, a sound from outside froze them both. Footsteps, clumsy and stumbling. Rhett's hand was on his Colt as he moved silently to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. A lone figure staggered through the darkness. Rhett relaxed slightly. "It's Levi." He opened the door just as his former deputy collapsed across the threshold. Levi's face was a ruin of fresh bruises, one eye swollen completely shut. "They're coming." He gasped, his speech slurred not just by whiskey, but by pain. "Bennett's got a posse, and they've hired Martinez." "Who's Martinez?" Clara asked, already moving to help the injured man. "Jake Rattlesnake Martinez," Rhett answered grimly, easing Levi into a chair. "Best tracker in the territory. If he's on our trail, they'll find us by sunrise." "What do we do?" Clara asked, her gaze steady on Rhett, her fear subordinate to her resolve. Rhett looked from her determined face to Levi's broken one. "We fight," he said. He turned his attention back to Levi, his voice hard with the weight of 9 years of unanswered questions. "But first, you're going to tell me what you know. Everything you were too afraid to say back then. What did my daughter see, Levi? What did Sarah see that got her killed?" Outside, a low rumble of thunder echoed through the canyon. A storm was coming in more ways than one. While Clara tended to Levi's cuts with whiskey and clean rags, the former deputy began to talk, the words spilling out in a torrent of guilt and stale liquor. It was always about the mine, he began, his voice raspy. 9 years ago, everyone thought it was played out. But Maxwell, he knew better. He found a new silver vein, a big one. But it was on Navajo land, the North Ridge. That's why he was so desperate to renegotiate the boundaries with the elders. Rhett said, the pieces beginning to click into place. Renegotiate. Levi snorted a bitter, painful sound. Chief Grey Wolf and 3 of his elders were found dead in the desert a week later. They called it an Apache raid. He met Rhett's eyes, the shame clear in his own. Convenient, wasn't it? The boundary dispute just disappeared. And the mine started pouring out silver. And Sarah Rhett's voice was dangerously quiet. Your daughter, she used to take food and medicines to that old Navajo woman, Thunderbird woman. Sarah learned about herbs from her. Rhett confirmed. The day before she died, I saw her coming from the North Ridge. She was running, Rhett. Running like the devil himself was on her heels. That night at the saloon, I heard Edgar bragging to his friends. Said he'd taught some nosy little thing a lesson she wouldn't forget. You never told me this. Rhett stated, the accusation hanging heavy in the small cabin. I tried to, Levi said miserably. The next morning they found her. By that afternoon, Maxwell had the council demanding your badge. I was a coward, Rhett. I saw what they did to you, and I kept my mouth shut. Clara, who had been listening intently, spoke up. Mrs. Reed knew. That's why she gave me the cross. She was trying to warn me. Rhett crossed to an old sea chest in the corner, unlocked it, and pulled out a small leather-bound book. Sarah's journal, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. He opened it to the last pages, the lamplight illuminating his daughter's neat looping script. He read aloud. April 18th. Thunderbird woman says the earth speaks if you know how to listen. We saw strange tracks on the North Ridge, boot prints and wagon wheels where no wagon should be. April 19th. I followed the tracks today. Saw Mr. Maxwell and Edgar at a hidden mine shaft. They were arguing with strangers about shipments and girls. Edgar saw me. I ran. I'm afraid he recognized me. I must tell Papa tomorrow. The final entry was a hurried scrawl. April 20th. Something is wrong. Edgar and his friends were waiting for me on the path from Thunderbird Woman's. I ran, but the entry ended there. She had never made it home. The silence that followed was profound. Girls, Clara whispered. The journal mentions girls. Levi nodded grimly. Over the past 9 years, at least a dozen young women have disappeared from the area. Maxwell calls it the unfortunate reality of frontier life. Says they run off or get taken by Indians. And the wooden crosses, Rhett asked, already knowing the answer. It's Maxwell's 6th signature, Levi spat. A mark for the ones who fight back. It started with Sarah. Rhett's hand closed around the journal, his knuckles white. The horror of it was a physical thing, a cold weight in his gut. This wasn't just about a stolen mine or a single murder. It was a factory of suffering operating right under the town's nose for nearly a decade. Suddenly, a horse whinnied just outside the cabin. Rhett doused the lamp instantly, plunging them into darkness. Get down, he whispered, his Colt appearing in his hand, as if by magic. Peering through the shutter, he saw a lone figure in the moonlight, examining the ground. The man wore a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. Martinez, Rhett breathed. He's here already. Rhett moved to the back door. Stay put. He slipped out into the night, using the junipers for cover as he circled around. Jake Martinez was crouched by the front step, his reputation preceding him. Half Apache, half Mexican, he was said to be able to track a ghost across slick rock. Rhett stepped into the clearing, his pistol aimed squarely at the tracker's back. "That's far enough, Jake." Martinez froze, then slowly raised his hands. "Callahan," he said, his voice calm. "Been a while. Turn around, slow." Martinez complied, revealing a lean, scarred face and eyes as dark and cold as a winter night. "Still fast on the draw, I see." "Fast enough. Bennett paying you well." "500 to find you. Another 500 to bring you in," Martinez said with a shrug. "Business is business." "And what's your business with the girls Edgar Maxwell makes disappear?" Rhett challenged. A flicker of something surprise, maybe something else, crossed the tracker's face. "Don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do. A man who tracks for a living, he sees things. Patterns. Girls who vanish. Bodies that sometimes wash up downstream." For a long moment, Martinez was silent. Then slowly, he reached for his belt. "Easy," he said, pulling out a folded piece of paper. He tossed it at Rhett's feet. Keeping his gun level, Rhett picked it up. It was a wanted poster. Not for him, but for Edgar Maxwell. Charges: kidnapping and murder. Jurisdiction: New Mexico Territory. Reward: $1,000. "I've been tracking him for months," Martinez said quietly. "The trail of missing girls led me here, to Redemption Creek." "Why should I believe you?" "Because I could have led Bennett's posse straight to you. Instead, I came alone." The hoofbeats of the approaching posse, now less than a couple of miles out, underscored his point. Rhett made a decision. He lowered his gun. "Get inside, all of you. We need to move." Inside the cabin, by the dim light of a heavily shuttered lamp, they forged a desperate alliance. Martinez confirmed their worst fears. Maxwell was running a sophisticated human trafficking operation. "They bring the girls in through an old north shaft," he explained, sketching a map on the table. "Keep them in the abandoned lower levels until buyers arrive." "Buyers," Clara's voice was tight with horror. "Rich men," Martinez said, his lip curling in disgust. "Men who want companionship without complications. A form of slavery." "And a new shipment is arriving tomorrow night," he added. The posse was getting closer. They could hear the jingle of harnesses and the low murmur of voices. "We need to move," Martinez urged. "There's a Navajo settlement in the canyons beyond the ridge. They have no love for Maxwell. We might find shelter there." They slipped out the back of the cabin, just as the first drops of a brewing storm began to fall, and the rain, a welcome accomplice, washing away their tracks as they vanished into the darkness, a small band of fugitives united against an empire of evil. Dawn found them in a hidden valley, a sanctuary of traditional Navajo hogans, nestled between towering red rock mesas. They had been met on the trail by warriors, and after a tense negotiation by Martinez, brought before their chief. The man was tall and weathered, with eyes that held the wisdom of generations. Blackhawk, Rhett said, recognizing the son of his old friend Thunderbird Woman. Callahan, the chief's voice was deep and resonant. "Many winters have passed. You returned because of your daughter." It was not a question. "Yes. And because the man who killed her is the same man who murdered your father and took your land." Blackhawk's stoic expression didn't change, but a flicker of acknowledgement showed in his eyes. He granted them sanctuary. As the others rested, he led Rhett to a small, isolated hogan. Inside, a young woman lay on a pallet of furs. She was gaunt, her eyes hollow pits of trauma, her arms covered in a lattice of fine white scars. "She came to us 3 moons ago," Blackhawk said quietly. "Found half dead in the desert. She does not speak." He handed Rhett a piece of bark covered in charcoal drawings. The images were horrifying: girls in cages, men in fine suits, and the recurring leering face of Edgar Maxwell. Rhett knelt beside the woman. She flinched, but he spoke her name. A name he'd heard whispered in the wind of rumor for 2 years. Hannah. She froze, her eyes widening. With a trembling hand, she reached for a piece of charcoal and drew 2 things: a sheriff's star, which she pointed at Rhett, and then a young girl with a wooden cross around her neck. Sarah. Rhett whispered, his voice thick. You knew Sarah. Tears streamed down her face as she nodded a silent, heartbreaking confirmation. She had been there. She had seen what happened. Their fragile peace was shattered when a scout ran into the camp. A posse was approaching from the east, larger than Bennett's, and they were led by a tracker wearing a rattlesnake skin on his hat. Eli Kane Martinez spat. Calls himself Rattlesnake Kane, a hired killer. Maxwell must have sent for him. We've brought danger to your people, Rhett said to Blackhawk. The chief's eyes flashed with a fire that had been banked for too long. The danger was already here, Callahan. It has been since Maxwell's shadow fell upon these lands. He turned to his warriors. Prepare for battle. We have waited 9 years for this day. Today we reclaim what was stolen. An alliance was forged not in words, but in shared purpose. They would make their stand at an abandoned copper mine a few miles west, a defensible position with narrow approaches and multiple escape routes. As they prepared to ride out, Hannah, the silent one, stood, a new light of resolve in her eyes. She pointed to herself, then to the horses. She was coming with them. She drew a crude map in the dirt showing a hidden entrance to the copper mine that only she knew. They rode hard, the sounds of Blackhawk's warriors engaging the approaching posse echoing behind them. The abandoned mine was a dark maw in a rust-colored cliff face. They took their positions, Martinez and Levi on the high ridges, Rhett and Clara at the entrance. Hannah, her silence now seeming less like fear and more like a coiled spring, stayed with them. When Kane's posse rode into the gulch, the air exploded with gunfire. The fight was brutal and desperate. Rhett and his allies were hopelessly outnumbered, but they held the superior ground. Kane, a ruthless and efficient fighter, pressed the attack, moving with deadly purpose toward the mine entrance. He cornered Rhett, his rifle spitting fire. A bullet grazed Rhett's arm. Just as Kane was about to fire the killing shot, Clara's shotgun roared the blast, catching the bounty hunter in the side and spinning him around. He staggered but raised his revolver, his face a mask of rage. "Feisty little thing," he snarled, aiming at Clara. Suddenly, a figure rushed past Rhett. It was Hannah. A feral scream, the first sound anyone had heard her make, tore from her throat as she launched herself at the wounded bounty hunter, a small, sharp rock clutched in her hand. The distraction was all Rhett needed. He fired, and Eli Kane fell for the last time. The rest of the posse, the Mesabasi, their leader, dead, faltered, and then fled. In the aftermath, Sheriff Bennett, who had hung back during the fight, rode forward under a white flag. "It's a trap," Martinez warned. "Maybe," Rhett said, "but we're out of options." That night they met Bennett at Thunderbird Woman's derelict cabin. The sheriff was a broken man. "Maxwell has my daughter," he confessed, handing Rhett a saddlebag heavy with documents. "Jenny. She disappeared 3 years ago. I thought she ran off. Now I know he took her. This is everything. Ledgers, names, dates. Enough to hang him." Just as he handed over the proof, the clearing was flooded with torchlight. Edgar Maxwell and his men surrounded them. Quite the reunion. Edgar sneered, his eyes falling on Hannah. "I thought you were dead." Then he looked at Bennett, his voice turning to ice. "My father will be so disappointed." Edgar revealed the horrifying truth. Bennett's own daughter had been one of the first girls taken use to ensure the sheriff's compliance. With a cry of pure anguish, Bennett drew his gun. The night erupted. Bennett was cut down in a hail of bullets. Rhett and the others were pinned down behind the cabin's porch as Maxwell's men set the roof ablaze. It seemed hopeless, until a new sound filled the night, the war cries of the Navajo. Black Hawk had followed them. The clearing became a whirlwind of chaotic violence. In the confusion, Edgar grabbed Clara, holding a pistol to her head. "Drop your weapons, Callahan, or she dies." Rhett slowly lowered his gun. As Edgar smiled and aimed at Rhett's heart, Hannah screamed again and charged a small herb knife she'd found in the overgrown garden clutched in her hand. Clara drove an elbow into Edgar's ribs, his shot going wide. Hannah crashed into him, plunging the knife into his side. Edgar roared, overpowering her, and drove the knife into her own chest. As he staggered up, Clara fired, hitting him in the shoulder. He turned to fire back, but a tomahawk flew from the darkness, embedding itself in his chest. Black Hawk stood over him, his face a mask of righteous fury. "For my father." The battle was over. In the light of the burning cabin, they surveyed the carnage. Bennett, barely alive, used his last breath to tell them Maxwell's conspiracy was bigger than they knew, involving the governor, and a plan to seize all Navajo land, not for silver, but for a massive gold vein discovered deep beneath their sacred mountains. The trafficking operation was merely the tool used to bribe, blackmail, and control the powerful men who were in on the deal. Their next and final move was clear. The governor was due to arrive at the mine the following night for a final meeting with Maxwell to launch their private war. They had to stop them not just for the girls, but for the fate of the entire territory. The plan was audacious, a two-pronged assault born of desperation and courage. While Black Hawk and his warriors launched a frontal diversionary attack on the fortified mine entrance, Rhett, Clara, and Martinez would infiltrate the complex through a network of forgotten tunnels Sarah had secretly mapped in her journal. Their objectives: free the captive girls, including Sheriff Bennett's long-lost daughter Jenny, and capture Thaddeus Maxwell and the governor alive. The air in the mine was cold and dead thick with the metallic scent of ore and the damp chill of the earth. Flickering lanterns cast long, dancing shadows that turned rock formations into lurking beasts. The only sounds were the distant drip of water, the scuttling of unseen creatures in the darkness, and the frantic pounding of their own hearts. They found the girls in a series of crude cells deep within the mountain, their eyes hollow with a despair that was almost worse than death. Among them was Jenny Bennett, frail and ghost-like, but alive. As Martinez worked to pick the locks, Rhett and Clara pressed on toward Maxwell's private office, the heart of the corrupt empire. They emerged from a hidden passage into a lavishly appointed cavern, a grotesque parody of a gentleman's club carved into the rock. Thaddeus Maxwell stood behind a massive oak desk, a glass of brandy in his hand, looking out at the chaos of the battle through a reinforced window. The governor cowered in a corner. "It's over, Maxwell," Rhett said, his Colt steady in his hand. Maxwell turned his face, betraying no surprise, only a weary, serpentine amusement. He was a man of medium height, with perfectly coiffed silver hair and eyes the color of a winter sky. He never raised his voice. "On the contrary, Mr. Callahan," he said, his tone conversational, almost pleasant. "For one of us, it is just beginning." He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Please, we have so much to discuss." Rhett did not move. "There's nothing to discuss." "Oh, but there is," Maxwell insisted, a chilling smile touching his lips. "There is the matter of a stagecoach a dozen years ago, near Devil's Pass. You were chasing the Newton gang, as I recall, riding with such righteous fury, such recklessness." Rhett's mind flashed back, a half-forgotten memory of dust and shouting and the splintering crash of wood, a runaway stagecoach. You don't even remember, do you? Maxwell's voice was soft, but laced with a venom that had been brewing for over a decade. My wife Eleanor was on that stage. My son Thomas, he was 8. They were on their way to visit her sister in Santa Fe. He took a slow sip of his brandy, his eyes never leaving Rhett's. On his desk, Rhett now saw a pristine silver-framed photograph of a smiling woman and a young boy. Your chase ran them off the road. Maxwell continued, his voice devoid of emotion. The official report called it a tragic accident. But I knew the truth. Your carelessness killed my family. You destroyed my world, Callahan. The truth landed with the force of a physical blow, reordering Rhett's entire understanding of the past 9 years. This wasn't about greed. It was about a monstrous, meticulously crafted revenge. So you built all of this? Rhett began, his voice hoarse. As a monument to my hate, Maxwell finished for him. I wanted to destroy everything you stood for. The law, order, justice. I wanted to take the town you protected and turn it into a cesspool. I wanted to corrupt the very system you served. His eyes glittered with a cold, triumphant fire. And I wanted you to suffer as I had suffered. To know the unique agony of losing a child. Sarah, Rhett choked out the name. She was a means to an end. A beautiful, defiant end. An eye for an eye, Callahan. A daughter for a son. It was justice. In that moment, Rhett felt a rage so pure and hot, it threatened to consume him. He raised his pistol, his finger tightening on the trigger. But Maxwell was prepared. He pressed a hidden button on his desk, and a section of the cavern ceiling above Clara, who had been moving to flank him, groaned and began to collapse. Timbers splintered and rock rained down. Rhett was faced with an impossible choice. A clear shot at the monster who had murdered his daughter, or the life of the woman who had become his partner in this quest. He didn't hesitate. He lunged, shoving Clara clear of the falling debris just as the tunnel entrance caved in, sealing them inside. Maxwell laughed, a dry, rasping sound. A man of principle to the very end. He raised his own pistol. But his victory was short-lived. A massive support beam dislodged by the collapse swung down like the pendulum of a great clock and struck him from behind. Thaddeus Maxwell, the architect of so much pain, fell without another word, his empire crumbling to dust around him. In the ringing silence that followed, they were trapped. But as the dust began to settle, they heard the sounds of digging. Blackhawk Martinez and the others were already working to clear the passage. Vengeance was a hollow thing, Rhett realized. But survival, and the chance to build something new from the ashes, was not. In the weeks that followed, Redemption Creek began the slow, painful process of healing, with the governor and his conspirators arrested by federal marshals, and Maxwell's empire dismantled. The town breathed clean air for the first time in a decade. The Navajo land claims were formally recognized, and a fragile peace settled over the territory. The changes were small at first, but meaningful. Levy Harmon, finding sobriety and purpose, organized the rebuilding of the town's burned-out sections. Clara Dawson reopened the seamstress shop, turning it into a safe haven and a place of employment for the rescued women, her quiet strength making her an unlikely but respected community leader. Jake Martinez, his bounty hunting days behind him, accepted the role of sheriff, his authority unquestioned. One clear autumn morning, Rhett Callahan walked to the town cemetery. He stopped before a simple stone marker that read, Sarah Callahan, beloved daughter. For 9 years, this place had been a monument to his failure. Today it felt different. He knelt, the old ache in his leg, a familiar companion. From his pocket, he withdrew the silver locket with the carved sparrow, the one from the girl in Dust Devil Flats. He had ridden back and found her, made sure she was safe, but kept the locket knowing its journey wasn't over. He gently placed it on the ground next to Sarah's headstone. It wasn't about avenging the dead anymore. It was about protecting the living in her memory. A promise. "Mr. Callahan." A voice interrupted his quiet reflection. A territorial marshal stood a respectful distance away. "I was sent to find you. With the territorial government being restructured, they're creating a new position. A special marshal tasked with rooting out the kind of corruption that festered here. They need a man of integrity, a man who knows the land and its people. Your name was at the top of the list." Rhett looked from the marshal's badge to Clara, who had walked up to stand beside him, her presence a silent offering of support. He thought of the long, empty years behind him, and the uncertain but not empty road ahead. His quest for vengeance was over. A new life of purpose was being offered in its place. He looked at the two silver lockets he imagined lying side by side, one buried with his daughter, the other a promise to the future. He would stay. He would build a just world on the foundations of his pain. He stood, his gaze clear and steady for the first time in 9 years, and accepted.